The night was drenched in a torrential downpour, its relentless pounding against the police car's roof muffling everything inside. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, blurring the city lights into a cascade of distorted colors. Ryan Mitchell, a seasoned patrol officer with a sharp jawline and dark circles beneath his eyes, stared into the rain-slicked road ahead. He adjusted the straps of his tactical vest. Beside him, his partner, Charlie, a black and tan German shepherd, sat with unsettling stillness, his golden eyes scanning the night through the half-open window. His ears were pricked, nostrils flaring as if something beyond Ryan's human perception was making itself known. "Something's off tonight, boy," Ryan muttered, glancing at Charlie. "I can feel it too." The sudden crackle of the radio broke the silence. A dispatcher's voice came through, sharp and urgent, cutting through the static. "Unit 12, come in. We have a 10 to 36 at the Western Drive warehouse. Possible armed robbery in progress. Suspects believed to be heavily armed. Proceed with caution. Backup is en route." Ryan's breath hitched. Western Drive was a part of town that hadn't seen action in years, a forgotten area that housed old warehouses and abandoned industrial buildings. Not the kind of place where you'd expect trouble at this hour. "Roger that," Ryan replied, his voice steady but taut with the weight of what lay ahead. He exhaled, feeling the familiar tension coil in his chest. Turning his head, he looked at Charlie again. The dog had not moved. His gaze was fixed, focused, sensing something Ryan couldn't quite grasp. "Stay close, boy. We might need you tonight." Ryan's hand found Charlie's head, his fingers brushing through the thick fur. The dog's warm, steady presence was a comfort in the growing unease. They drove on in silence, the car's headlights cutting through the storm as the warehouse loomed closer. The hulking structure stood as an empty sentinel on the edge of the city, its rusting metal walls creaking in the wind. The place looked abandoned, but Ryan knew better. Danger had a way of hiding in the most unlikely places. He parked the squad car at the edge of the property, just out of sight. The rain was unrelenting, soaking through his uniform almost immediately as Ryan stepped out into the night. He surveyed the area, listening to the soft drip of water against the pavement. No movement, no sign of life. Charlie jumped out of the car, his paws hitting the wet ground silently. The dog was a professional, his senses far beyond Ryan's, his instincts honed from years of working alongside him. The air was thick with tension, a heaviness that made every step feel like a whisper. "Let's move," Ryan ordered quietly, his hand on the grip of his gun. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. A single light flickered weakly above the entrance, casting a long, eerie shadow. Ryan approached cautiously, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground as he made his way toward the rusted door. Suddenly, a loud noise, a clatter, echoed from within. Something had fallen. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. Charlie's ears shot up, his body tense. Without hesitation, the dog's low growl rumbled in his chest, the sound of warning that sent a shiver up Ryan's spine. "Easy, boy. We're going in slow," Ryan whispered, but the dog was already alert. There was no turning back now. Ryan stepped into the dark threshold of the warehouse, his flashlight slicing through the shadows. The air smelled of mildew and oil. The floor was cluttered with discarded crates and rusted machinery. He could hear the faint sound of voices, low, hurried whispers. Without warning, a sharp pain exploded in Ryan's left side. A searing, blinding pain that knocked the wind out of him. He gasped, staggering back as the blood soaked through his uniform. His legs gave way, and he collapsed onto the cold, damp concrete floor. Charlie lunged immediately, a vicious growl escaping his throat as he positioned himself protectively over Ryan's fallen form. His eyes, glowing in the dim light, fixed on the three figures now emerging from the shadows. Ryan's vision blurred. He could see the faint outline of a figure in front of him, one hand holding something shiny, something that caught the dim light. A weapon, a gun, a knife? He couldn't tell, his vision fading too quickly. "Charlie, no!" Ryan barely managed to whisper, his voice shaky and weak. His hand reached out, but fell short. Charlie's ears were flat against his head as the dog's hackles rose. The three figures stepped forward. One was tall and lean, his face hidden beneath a hood. The second was shorter, with a stocky build, his hands clenched into fists. The third figure, a woman, was holding a glinting metal object, the reflection of it almost mocking in the gloom. Charlie's growl grew louder, deeper. The tension was unbearable. And then, in a move that would forever alter the course of the night, Charlie surged forward, his teeth bared, the force of his attack swift and savage. The first attacker went down with a sharp yelp as Charlie sank his teeth into his arm, the sound of ripping fabric and flesh echoing through the warehouse. Ryan, his vision swimming, could barely stay conscious. But he knew one thing for sure. Charlie was his partner, and there was no one more loyal than him. As the scene unfolded before him, Ryan's grip on reality began to slip. What would happen next, who the attackers were, and what they wanted, was still unclear. But one thing was certain. Ryan had just been thrust into something much larger than a routine patrol. Ryan's vision swirled, each second feeling like an eternity. The cold concrete beneath him felt distant, as if the world around him was closing in, the storm outside muffling every sound. His breath came in ragged bursts, his pulse hammering in his ears. Charlie was a blur of motion. His powerful jaws locked onto the first attacker's arm, forcing him to the ground with a snarl. The man's scream echoed through the empty space, a guttural cry that was quickly cut off by the sharp crack of bone. Ryan forced himself to focus. His hand, slick with blood, crawled toward his holster, but the pain was overwhelming. He could barely make sense of what was happening, his limbs growing heavier with each passing second. Charlie's growls reverberated, and for a moment, it seemed like the night would end in chaos. The second attacker, stocky and fast, lunged at Charlie, his fists aimed at the dog's ribs. Charlie dodged, snapping his teeth just inches from the man's arm. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. This was bad. They were outnumbered. But then, the third figure, quiet, almost ethereal, moved like a shadow through the space. She held her weapon, what Ryan could now make out as a large, gleaming hunting knife, poised, ready. Her eyes flickered toward him, a dangerous calm settling over her features. She'd been watching, waiting. "Charlie, stay with me." Ryan tried to call out, but his voice was weak, more of a strained rasp. His hand closed around the hilt of his gun, and he pulled it free with trembling fingers. His arm barely had the strength to aim. The woman's lips curled into a smirk as she approached, her boots silent on the wet concrete. Her focus was on Charlie, but her eyes flicked to Ryan, mocking, calculating. "You really think you're gonna make it out of this?" she asked in a low, almost amused voice. Ryan's heart raced. There was something familiar in her eyes, something he couldn't quite place. A coldness, a detached calculation. Before he could react, the woman snapped her arm forward, hurling the knife. It sliced through the air with deadly precision, but Charlie, just in time, dodged the blade, diving beneath it and crashing into her legs. She staggered back, momentarily losing her balance. Ryan gritted his teeth, knowing this was his chance. With every ounce of will he could muster, he forced himself into a sitting position, raising his gun with shaky hands. "Don't make me shoot you," he growled, his voice hoarse but firm. The woman's smirk widened, and she tilted her head as though she were admiring the situation rather than feeling threatened. "You're not in a position to make threats, officer," she said softly, her tone almost affectionate. Ryan could feel his grip slipping on the gun. His vision was blurring. The blood loss was too much, and he wasn't sure how long he could stay conscious. But Charlie wasn't about to let this go down. The dog barked loudly, charging once more toward the woman. She stepped back quickly, her eyes flicking to the corner of the warehouse. In that brief moment, Ryan noticed something he hadn't before, two more figures emerging from the shadows. They weren't attackers. They were cops, uniformed, but their expressions were cold. They weren't here to help. They were here for something else. Ryan's heart clenched. This was no simple robbery. This was an ambush. The two new officers, both wearing tactical vests like Ryan, stepped into the light, their hands relaxed by their sides, but their eyes sharp, deadly sharp. Ryan's heart sank as he recognized the badge on the taller of the two. Officer Evan Blake, his former partner. Blake had disappeared from the force 2 years ago under mysterious circumstances. No one had seen or heard from him since. The rumors had swirled. Some said he was dead. Others said he'd gone rogue. But Ryan never imagined he'd see him here, standing in a derelict warehouse, part of an operation that seemed anything but lawful. "Blake?" Ryan whispered hoarsely, his hand still gripping his gun, but his body heavy with exhaustion. "What the hell is going on here?" Blake's eyes locked with his, no flicker of recognition or warmth. Just cold detachment. "You really don't get it, do you, Ryan?" Blake said, his voice low and measured. "This was always meant to happen. You just never saw the bigger picture." Ryan's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't happening. His mind was racing, but the blood loss was starting to take its toll. His vision doubled and tripled, and his fingers grew numb, slipping from his gun. Charlie, still fiercely protective, growled at the two officers. His stance was defensive, ready to fight to the death. "Charlie!" Ryan gasped, trying to keep his focus. He needed to make sense of what was happening before it was too late. Blake took a slow step forward, unfazed by the dog's snarls. "You've been a good cop, Ryan. But sometimes, good cops get in the way of bigger things." Ryan couldn't understand. The pain was overwhelming, but the words rang in his ears like an alarm. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ryan managed to rasp. Blake's lips twitched into something resembling a smile, but it was twisted, cruel. He nodded toward the woman with the knife, who was now standing still, waiting. "She's the one you need to worry about. As for me, I'm here to tie up loose ends." Before Ryan could process the meaning of Blake's words, a strange noise cut through the warehouse. A sharp, mechanical sound, like a door sliding open. The woman looked over at the source, her expression shifting. Ryan tried to follow her gaze, but his vision was too blurry. Then, with the flick of a switch, a panel on the far wall of the warehouse slid open, revealing a large, sleek black SUV. It was clearly out of place in the gritty surroundings of the old warehouse. A man stepped out, wearing a black suit, and for a brief moment, Ryan thought he saw him move with a familiarity that unsettled him even more. The man's eyes locked onto Ryan's, and in that instant, Ryan recognized him. Victor Cruz, a name he hadn't heard in years. Cruz had been a notorious figure in the city's underground world, rumored to have been behind a string of high-profile heists and robberies. Ryan's mind reeled. This was no random robbery. This was part of something much larger. And now, it seemed, he had been caught in the crosshairs of a much darker conspiracy. Victor Cruz stepped out of the SUV with an air of cold authority, his black suit sharp against the backdrop of rusted metal and shadows. The sudden clarity of his presence made everything else seem like it had slowed down. His pale face was impassive, but his eyes, dark and calculating, swept over Ryan with unsettling ease. Ryan tried to focus, to keep his gun steady, but it was growing increasingly difficult. The blood was pooling around him, and the world felt distant, a muffled haze of sound and color. Charlie, still protectively positioned by Ryan's side, didn't seem to care about the unfamiliar faces or the tension in the air. His ears were flattened, his teeth bared, but the dog's energy was also waning. Ryan's heart twisted in his chest as he saw his partner, his loyal companion, begin to sag with exhaustion, the fight gradually draining from him. Cruz's eyes flicked to Charlie, then to Ryan. The corner of his lips twitched upward in what could have been mistaken for a grin, if it wasn't so sinister. "You really don't know, do you?" Cruz's voice was smooth, cultured, yet there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Ryan's spine. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor. "All of this, everything you've known about your life as a cop, about your job, about justice, it's just a game. A carefully constructed illusion." Ryan's pulse quickened, even though every instinct in his body told him he was past the point of survival. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been walking through a carefully laid trap, one that was about to snap shut around him. "You're not going to make it out of here alive, officer," Cruz continued, his voice growing more deliberate. "But don't worry. There's a bigger picture. a bigger plan, and you're a part of it, whether you like it or not. Ryan's mind raced. He had to keep it together, even as his vision swam and his chest tightened with every breath. Blake, this is you, isn't it? Ryan said through clenched teeth, his voice raw. You were never gone. This whole thing, this mess, it's all you're doing. Blake didn't respond. He only watched, his face unreadable, as Cruz spoke again, this time directly addressing him. Blake, we don't have time for this, Cruz said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable authority. You've done your part. We're moving forward now. Ryan, through a haze of pain, could see it. Blake's subtle nod. It was confirmation. Blake wasn't just a corrupt cop. He was one of them, a piece of a much larger puzzle. You want answers? Cruz continued, his gaze never leaving Ryan. I'll give them to you. But first, you have to understand one thing. Everything you thought you knew about good and evil, right and wrong, has been a lie. This city has been a breeding ground for power, for influence, for control. The justice you fought for? It's nothing but a tool to keep the masses in line while we build something greater. Ryan shook his head weakly, trying to focus. You're insane. This is all about money, isn't it? You're just after control, power. Not just power, Cruz corrected, his voice low. The kind of control that transcends everything. You see, Ryan, the system doesn't work unless you break it. The law doesn't hold up unless you show people that it can be bent. And once you have them believing that, once you have them questioning everything, they'll follow. Ryan's stomach churned. This wasn't about money. This wasn't even about power in the traditional sense. It was about something far more dangerous, an idea. The kind of idea that could topple cities and governments if planted in the right minds. The woman with the knife had stepped back, watching the exchange with a detached interest. Her eyes, however, never left Ryan. He had the sinking feeling she was waiting for the right moment to strike. Blake took a step closer to Ryan, his boots echoing in the otherwise silent warehouse. It was never supposed to be like this, Ryan. You weren't supposed to get involved, but you did. Blake's gaze dropped briefly to Charlie. And now, here we are. A mess that needs cleaning up. Ryan's heart sank. The finality in Blake's voice made it clear. Ryan had been caught in a web far larger than he could ever have imagined. He had to act. His gun was still in his hand, but his fingers were slippery with blood, his grip faltering. His mind was racing, struggling to latch onto any rational thought. But then, something inside him clicked. Instinct took over. Charlie, Ryan whispered hoarsely. The dog, his partner, loyal to the end, was still there, standing guard. A quiet growl rumbled in Charlie's throat as his eyes flicked to Ryan. He could feel the change in the air, the surge of energy as his handler prepared to do whatever he could to make sure they both made it out alive. Ryan's mind worked with urgency, pulling through the fog of pain. He couldn't take them all down. Not like this. But there was something he could do. He had to buy them time. With a sharp gasp, Ryan raised his gun with what little strength he had left. His vision blurred even more, but he focused on Cruz, on the only person who seemed to be the true mastermind here. You don't get to walk away, Ryan spat, the words forced through gritted teeth. He fired. The shot rang out through the warehouse, deafening in its clarity. But the result wasn't what Ryan expected. The bullet missed. Barely. Cruz had moved in a fluid, almost unnatural motion, ducking to the side at the last second. The shot grazed his shoulder, causing him to stumble back slightly, but it wasn't a direct hit. Ryan's heart sank. His aim had been too weak, his body too spent. He couldn't take him down like this. And that's when Ryan realized the true horror of the situation. Cruz wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He was something more, something that wasn't just human. Cruz smirked, touching the blood on his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. You should have stayed out of this, Ryan, he said softly, his voice as chilling as the cold wind outside. The moment Cruz smirked, everything fell into place for Ryan. It wasn't the confidence of a criminal mastermind. It wasn't the self-assuredness of someone who thought they had one. No, there was something else, something ancient, something far darker in Cruz's eyes. His smirk, though cruel, held a deeper implication. Ryan felt it in the pit of his stomach. Cruz wasn't just a player in this game. He was the architect. Cruz wiped the blood from his shoulders slowly, savoring the sting, as if it was proof of something far more intricate than a simple near miss. He tilted his head, as though admiring Ryan's futile effort. "I didn't want to do this the hard way," Cruz said, his voice calm, too calm. "But you forced my hand." Ryan's blood was pumping loudly in his ears. He could feel the overwhelming weight of exhaustion pressing down on him like a vice, his body betraying him in the worst possible way. His breath was shallow, uneven. He wasn't going to make it out of here, not without a miracle. Charlie, still standing vigilantly beside Ryan, growled low in his throat, but even the dog seemed to sense the growing danger. His posture was defensive, but he was slowing down too, his movements a little more sluggish than before. Ryan's eyes darted between his loyal companion and Cruz. "What are you?" Ryan managed to gasp. His voice, already hoarse from blood loss, now trembled with fear. Cruz smiled again, but this time it was more knowing than mocking. He reached up to adjust his cufflinks, an odd, almost casual gesture for someone in the middle of a standoff. "A man of action," Cruz said softly, "but you're too busy asking the wrong questions. Let me ask you something, Ryan. Do you know what makes people like me special?" Ryan blinked, confused. "You're insane." Cruz laughed softly, the sound almost melodic. "You're closer than you think. The thing is, Ryan, I'm not just a man. I'm part of a movement." A cold realization began to creep into Ryan's mind, but he was still too foggy to put it together fully. Blake stepped forward, his eyes flat and expressionless. "Cruz doesn't mean just special in the way you think. It's not about influence. It's about evolution." Ryan's head swam. Evolution? He blinked again, forcing his vision into focus. He tried to push through the dizziness, struggling to make sense of what was happening. You're talking about..." Ryan couldn't finish his sentence. His voice cracked under the weight of his own disbelief. "You're starting to understand," Cruz said, his voice lowering into a quiet, almost hypnotic tone. "The truth is, Ryan, the world is changing. Society is stagnating, clinging to outdated systems of control. But he let out a low laugh, almost a purr. "We have the power to shape a new future, one where the strongest survive, one where we control who gets to evolve." The words felt like a punch in the gut. Ryan's blood ran cold. "I've been working for years, Ryan," Cruz continued, "building a new order, a new kind of government, not one made of laws, but one made of force, of power, of people who know what it takes to control. We aren't just changing the game, we're rewriting it." Blake nodded. "You've always believed in justice, Ryan. But what you don't understand is that justice isn't real. It's a tool. It's a system to keep the weak in check. But we're going beyond that now. We're creating the next stage of humanity." The blood drained from Ryan's face as he pieced together the fragments of what Cruz was saying. This wasn't just about crime. This wasn't just some elaborate plot for money or power. They were talking about something far more disturbing. A philosophy that was as dangerous as it was insane. "You're talking about changing people," Ryan whispered. You've been experimenting." Cruz's eyes gleamed. "Not just experimenting, Ryan. Evolving. The human race can be so much more than it is. We can push beyond the limits of biology. We can move past these fragile, useless bodies." Ryan's mind reeled. He tried to process the words. "You're creating superhumans. Soldiers, weapons." "Yes," Cruz said, his smile widening. "And you're almost there, Ryan. You're closer than you think." Before Ryan could respond, the woman with the knife, who had been standing silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward, her cold gaze fixed on Ryan. She was moving now with purpose, not as an ally, but as part of the machinery. "We need to finish this," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. Ryan could feel the pressure mounting. He was dying. There was no way around it. But this was a far worse fate than death. He could see it now. This wasn't just a small criminal syndicate. This was something far more insidious. It was a movement, a new order rising from the ashes of the old one, and Ryan was just a pawn in it. Charlie's growl deepened, more urgent now. Ryan's mind was sharp despite the haze of pain. "I can't let this happen," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Suddenly, a thought struck him. If he could just buy enough time. If he could just... Without warning, Ryan moved. He wasn't sure how he found the strength, but the adrenaline coursing through his body, fueled by sheer survival instinct, propelled him. He lifted the gun one last time, pointing it directly at Cruz's head. His vision was blurry, his strength failing, but there was a moment of clarity. "You've underestimated me," Ryan rasped, more to himself than anyone else. Cruz, despite the looming threat of Ryan's weapon, only smiled. It wasn't a smile of fear, but one of sadistic amusement. "You really don't understand, do you, Ryan?" Cruz's voice dropped, thick with cold finality. "This is bigger than you. You can't stop it. No one can. Not anymore." Ryan's finger hovered over the trigger. He couldn't feel his body anymore. His hand was shaking uncontrollably, but he held on. The moment felt eternal. Bang. But the shot wasn't aimed at Cruz. Ryan had fired the gun at the ground. The sound of the bullet ricocheting through the warehouse as the shockwave of noise flooded his ears. For a split second, everything froze. The warehouse was eerily quiet except for the heavy breathing and the sound of distant rain outside. Ryan knew that in that instant, he had done something desperate, something irrational. But it was enough. The sudden noise startled Charlie, and the dog, reacting in an instant, lunged forward toward the woman with the knife, his powerful body knocking her off balance. It was the distraction Ryan needed. The shot, though not aimed at Cruz, had shattered the tension in the room like glass. The echo reverberated through the cold walls of the warehouse, the sound carrying the weight of desperation and defiance. Charlie's bark broke the silence, a primal roar that roused something deep within Ryan. The dog lunged with explosive speed, his massive body colliding with the woman holding the knife. She staggered back, caught off guard by the unexpected force. Her grip loosened, the knife falling to the floor with a dull clatter. In that brief, heart-stopping moment, time seemed to slow down for Ryan. He could hear the ragged sound of his breath, feel his heartbeat pulsing in his ears, and see the swirling images around him as if they were miles away. The world was beginning to darken around the edges. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Ryan forced himself to his feet, using the carbine rifle that had been slung across his body as leverage. His legs were unsteady, and the pain in his side flared with every movement, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him going. Charlie had the woman pinned to the ground now, his powerful jaws clamped around her arm, keeping her from reaching for the knife. The woman struggled, her face contorting with rage, but Charlie's grip was unyielding, his growls filled with a raw, protective fury. Ryan's eyes flicked back to Cruz. He had yet to move, his expression still eerily calm. But there was something different now, something flickering beneath his composed facade. Ryan could see it in the way Cruz's eyes narrowed, the tension in his shoulders. "Is this how it ends?" Ryan rasped, his voice weak but defiant. Cruz didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow step back, as though to assess the situation. "You still don't get it," he said, his voice almost too quiet to hear over the chaos. "This isn't about you, Ryan. You're nothing but an obstacle, a small, insignificant cog in a much larger machine." Ryan's heart skipped. A cog. That's what he was to Cruz, just another part of the puzzle. He wasn't going to win. Not against someone like Cruz. Not against the things that were happening here. But as Ryan's eyes scanned the room, the desperation inside him burned brighter than ever. He couldn't give up. Not with Charlie still fighting beside him. Not with so much at stake. "I'll take you down with me," Ryan said, his voice steadier now, a glint of determination piercing through the fog. "You're not leaving here. Not while I still have a breath in my body." Cruz's lips curled into that same, unsettling smile. "We'll see about that." Ryan's fingers clenched around the gun. This wasn't over. He refused to let it be over. In the midst of the chaos, Ryan saw Blake move. It was a subtle thing, almost imperceptible at first. A shift of his weight, a barely noticeable glance toward Cruz. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. There was something in Blake's eyes. something that didn't belong to the man he once knew. For all the years they had worked together, for all the camaraderie they had shared, Ryan had never imagined Blake could be part of something like this. But the truth was undeniable. Blake wasn't just playing both sides. He had already chosen. Ryan's mind raced, trying to piece together how this had gone so wrong. He thought back to the whispers, the rumors, Blake's sudden disappearance, the things that didn't add up, the subtle hints that something darker had been happening beneath the surface of the city. Blake was part of it, part of this twisted new world that Cruz was trying to build. Ryan's pulse quickened, and his hand tightened around the grip of the gun. He needed to take Blake down, now, before Cruz's plans could fully come to fruition. But Blake wasn't looking at him anymore. Instead, his gaze had shifted to the woman on the ground, still struggling beneath Charlie's grip. Blake's eyes were cold, calculating. "No," Ryan said, suddenly realizing the next move. "No, don't." Before Ryan could react, Blake stepped forward, his hand gripping the tactical knife at his side. In one swift motion, he threw it, not toward Ryan, but at Charlie. It happened so quickly that Ryan couldn't stop it. The blade flew through the air, cutting through the haze of rainwater that was dripping from the rafters, its path true. The moment the blade struck, Charlie let out a high-pitched yelp, a noise Ryan had never heard from his loyal partner before. The dog's body shuddered as the knife sunk deep into his shoulder, the blade embedding itself in the muscle. "Charlie!" Ryan screamed, a surge of pain shooting through his chest as he watched his partner's body falter. Charlie staggered back, growling in agony but refusing to submit. His legs shook, his breathing heavy, but his instincts kept him at Ryan's side. No matter the injury, Ryan's heart pounded, a wild, angry beat in his chest. He couldn't think, not clearly. His vision swirled with panic, but there was only one thought in his mind: protect Charlie. In one swift motion, Ryan dropped to his knees beside his dog, pulling the knife from Charlie's shoulder. The wound was deep, but Ryan didn't have time to assess it. Not yet. He had to finish this. Ryan's eyes burned with determination as he looked up at Cruz and Blake. He had no plan, no backup, no strength, but he had will. And sometimes, that was all a man needed. The warehouse had gone silent again. The only sounds now the heavy panting of Charlie and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. Ryan's grip on the gun tightened, and he slowly began to rise, locking eyes with Cruz. "This ends now," Ryan growled, his voice filled with a ferocity that shocked even him. For a moment, everything stood still. Time seemed to stretch, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting to see who would break first. Ryan, his knees unsteady, cradled Charlie's injured form against him. His hands were slick with the dog's blood, and his own pain was a distant, numbing ache that had blurred into the background. Charlie's labored breathing was the only thing that tethered Ryan to reality. Blake stood across from him, his cold eyes devoid of remorse. The knife had been thrown with precision, but it hadn't broken the bond between them, not entirely. There was something still there, something buried under the years of camaraderie and shared experiences. But Blake was no longer the man Ryan had trusted. Ryan's gun shook in his hands as he raised it, pointing it toward Blake, but his vision was slipping. The edges of his world were starting to darken, and for a fleeting moment, he feared that he might pass out before he could do anything. Cruz, standing behind Blake, watched the standoff with the same calculated calm. His eyes didn't flicker, didn't betray a single ounce of fear. He seemed to enjoy the tension, savoring the slow dance of conflict unfolding before him. "You're not in control here, Ryan," Cruz said, his voice smooth and reassuring, like a predator toying with its prey. "You never were. You just don't see the bigger picture." Ryan's hand tightened on the grip of his gun, his finger inching toward the trigger. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He couldn't care anymore. Charlie's head rested against his knee, the dog's tail giving a weak, almost imperceptible thump on the cold concrete floor. His once fierce eyes were now dull, filled with pain, but there was something else, something that sparked hope in Ryan's chest. Charlie was still with him, still fighting, and as long as his partner was fighting, so would Ryan. "I've seen enough," Ryan rasped, forcing his voice to steady. "And I'm done playing your game." Blake's lips parted slightly, as though he were about to speak, but Cruz's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Blake," Cruz said, his voice commanding, "get rid of him. Now." For a moment, Ryan's heart skipped. He didn't know what Cruz had meant, but the words had struck a chord deep inside. His instincts were screaming at him, telling him that something far worse was about to happen. Blake moved. It wasn't the slow, deliberate step of a man preparing for a fight. It was a sudden, calculated action. Blake lunged forward, faster than Ryan had ever seen him move, his hands reaching for the gun. Ryan's breath hitched as Blake's figure blurred in his peripheral vision. Instinctively, he fired. The shot rang out, but Blake was already too close, his body moving like a shadow. The bullet missed, barely grazing Blake's shoulder as he closed the distance between them. Ryan's mind raced. He couldn't lose this fight. He couldn't lose Charlie. Blake was upon him, his hands grabbing for the gun. Ryan struggled to keep it steady, his fingers slipping on the grip, the blood from Charlie's wound making it impossible to get a proper hold. Blake's strength was unmatched, his grip like iron, pulling the weapon from Ryan's hand in a single, brutal movement. Ryan's eyes locked onto Blake's, and for a split second, there was a flicker of something. Something Ryan almost recognized, a spark of humanity. But then Blake's face hardened again, and all that was left was coldness. "You should have stayed away from this, Ryan," Blake muttered, his voice low and hollow. "Now it's too late." Ryan's heart slammed in his chest, but his mind was already working, calculating the next move. He had no gun, no weapon, but there was still one card left to play. The ground beneath him was wet, slick with rainwater that had seeped in from the outside. As Blake advanced, Ryan's eyes flicked to the ground, and in a single, desperate motion, he lunged for the nearest object, a rusted metal pipe that had been discarded in the corner. With all the force left in his body, Ryan swung it at Blake, connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crack. Blake staggered back, momentarily stunned, and Ryan seized the opportunity. His body screamed in protest, but he didn't care. He lunged at Blake, using the momentary distraction to knock him off balance. The two men tumbled to the ground, struggling. Blake tried to regain his composure, but Ryan, fueled by desperation and the bond he shared with Charlie, kept fighting. Ryan's fists pummeled Blake's chest, and for the first time, the reality of the situation hit him with full force. He was fighting a man who had once been his partner, a man who had once trusted him, and now, Blake was a part of something far darker than anything Ryan could have imagined. But there was no room for sentiment now, no time for hesitation. Ryan's vision blurred again as the pain in his side flared up, but he pushed through it. He couldn't let Cruz win. He couldn't let Blake carry out whatever twisted plan they had for the city, for the people. With a final, brutal shove, Ryan knocked Blake off of him, sending the man sprawling onto the floor. Blake gasped for air, disoriented from the impact, and Ryan scrambled to his feet. He grabbed the gun, his gun, the one he had lost only moments before. But as Ryan aimed it at Blake, something unexpected happened. Cruz spoke again, his voice filled with authority. "You've lost, Ryan. It's over." Ryan didn't flinch. He didn't let his gaze waver from Blake's face. But something in Cruz's words, in the way they were delivered, caused a seed of doubt to grow deep inside him. Cruz wasn't just talking about Ryan losing this fight. He was talking about something else, something far more insidious. As Ryan looked at Cruz, he finally understood. This wasn't just about control. This wasn't just about power. This was about turning people, even those who had once fought for justice, into something they could control, into tools. And Blake? Blake had already crossed that line. With his finger on the trigger, Ryan hesitated for the briefest moment, his mind catching up to the truth. It wasn't Blake that he had to stop. It was Cruz. The hesitation in Ryan's hand lasted a moment, but it felt like an eternity. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. His finger hovered over the trigger, and for the first time in his life, Ryan wasn't sure if he was ready to pull it. Blake's breathing was shallow, his chest heaving in the aftermath of the brutal struggle. His eyes were still cold, But there was something else there too. Something flickering, something almost human. Ryan could feel the weight of the gun in his hand. He could feel the lives it had taken, the lives it could take again. But there was something deeper, something he couldn't ignore. Blake wasn't the real enemy here. Cruz was. The realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Cruz had always been the mastermind, the puppet master pulling the strings. Blake, for all his involvement, had been swept up in something much larger than himself. He was a casualty in Cruz's war, a war Ryan hadn't even realized was being waged. "Ryan," Blake rasped, his voice low and strained. "You don't understand. It's not too late. You can still join us?" Ryan's eyes narrowed. The offer wasn't new, but it hit differently now. The truth of Cruz's plan had settled in his bones, and for the first time, Ryan saw Blake for what he truly was, a victim. Just like him. He wasn't sure why Blake had made the choices he did, but Ryan knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let Cruz win. He wasn't going to become another cog in the machine. "I'm not joining you," Ryan spat. His grip tightened on the gun. "And neither are you." The tension between them was palpable, the air heavy with the scent of rain and blood. It felt as if the entire world had stopped spinning, and the only thing that mattered was the standoff between two men who had once fought for the same cause. But that was before Cruz had come into their lives, before everything had fallen apart. Ryan's eyes flicked to Cruz. The man was still standing there, watching with a detached amusement, as if this was all part of some carefully scripted drama. "You're both so predictable," Cruz said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think you can stop this? You think you can change anything? No one can fight what's coming, Ryan. The wheels are already in motion. The world is changing, and you can either be part of it, or you can die like the rest." The words hit Ryan like a punch to the gut, but there was something in Cruz's tone, something that didn't add up. The certainty, the arrogance. Cruz had always believed he was untouchable, but now, for the first time, Ryan saw the cracks in his armor. "You're wrong," Ryan said quietly. "You've underestimated everyone." Blake stirred slightly, but Ryan kept his eyes on Cruz. His mind raced. He was out of options, out of time. But there was something Cruz hadn't counted on. Ryan wasn't alone anymore. The sound of a door creaking open echoed in the distance, and for a brief second, Ryan thought he was imagining it. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by a voice he hadn't heard in years. "Ryan." Ryan's heart skipped, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable. "Eva," he whispered, his eyes widening in disbelief. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, stepping into the dim light of the warehouse. Eva Westbrook, his partner, the woman who had disappeared months ago, the one he had feared was lost to the very darkness he was fighting against. But she was here. She was alive. And, judging by the gun in her hand, she wasn't here to negotiate. "Ryan," she said again, her voice firm but filled with something he couldn't quite place. Relief, anger, maybe both. "We don't have much time." Ryan's mind raced, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was she part of this? Had she always known what Cruz was planning? And if she had, why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she come to him sooner? Eva's eyes flicked to Cruz, her gaze hardening. "You were right about one thing, Cruz. The world is changing, but it's not the way you think. You're not going to be the one to control it." Cruz's lips twitched into a smile, though it was a cruel, twisted thing. "Ah, Eva, you were always the smart one. Too bad you couldn't see the future as clearly as I have." Eva's gun never wavered as she stepped forward, her eyes locked on Cruz. "The future's already here, Cruz. And you're not part of it." Ryan blinked, trying to catch up. What was happening? Eva, his Eva, was pointing a gun at Cruz, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ryan felt a spark of hope. "Eva, Ryan started, but she raised a hand, silencing him. "I know," she said simply. "I know everything." Eva's words hit Ryan like a wave crashing against rocks. She knew. She had known this whole time, but the look in her eyes told him there was more, something that hadn't quite made sense yet. As if reading his thoughts, Eva gave a small, sad smile. "I didn't want to believe it either," Ryan. But when I found out what Cruz was really doing, there was no choice. I had to act. Ryan's mind spun. He hadn't imagined this. He hadn't wanted to imagine this. He had feared Eva had betrayed him. But now, looking at her, he saw the truth. She wasn't a part of Cruz's plan. She was fighting against it, just like him. Then let's finish this, Ryan said, his voice hoarse but full of resolve. Eva nodded. Without another word, she gestured for Ryan to move. The warehouse had turned into a battlefield, and now, with Eva standing at his side, Ryan finally understood what he had to do. He had to stop Cruz, not just for himself, but for the world that was at stake. The future that Cruz was trying to shape with his hands, with Blake and the others as his pawns. The air was thick with the smell of blood, sweat, and rain. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, it was quieter than it had been in hours. Every breath felt like the calm before an explosion. Ryan and Eva moved in sync now, as if the years apart hadn't happened at all. There was no time to talk, no time for explanations. This was it. This was the endgame. Cruz watched them both carefully, his eyes calculating, but his smile was gone. The smugness had evaporated, replaced by something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. You think you can stop me? Cruz's voice was almost a whisper, but it held an undeniable edge of fury. You think you can win? Ryan's eyes narrowed. We already have. Eva raised her gun, aiming directly at Cruz. It's over, Cruz. The world seemed to hold its breath as Ryan moved. His eyes locked on Cruz's, his hand steady on the grip of his own gun. But before he could take the final shot, something happened. Blake, still dazed from the earlier struggle, lunged forward. His body was a blur of motion, his hand reaching for Cruz's discarded weapon. Ryan's heart skipped. This wasn't over yet. Blake moved with surprising speed despite the blood seeping from his wounds. His fingers wrapped around Cruz's discarded gun, and in a heartbeat, he was pointing it directly at Ryan and Eva. The air seemed to crackle with tension. Eva's gun was still aimed at Cruz, her finger on the trigger, but her eyes flicked to Blake, a mix of disbelief and caution flickering across her face. No, Ryan muttered under his breath. His hand tightened around his own gun, but there was no clear shot, not with Blake in the way. Blake's eyes were vacant, distant. His breath came in ragged bursts, and his grip on the gun wavered. It was clear that he was struggling, his body fighting against the reality of his choices, the damage done, both physically and mentally. Blake, please, Ryan said, his voice raw with frustration. This isn't you. You don't have to do this. But Blake's gaze never wavered. It was as if the man standing before Ryan wasn't the same person who had shared beers with him after long shifts, who had laughed with him about stupid things, who had been a friend. You don't get it, Ryan, Blake said, his voice cold, almost mechanical. You never did. There's no going back. Cruz was right. The old world's dead. The people like us, the ones who still believe in honor, in right and wrong, we're the ones who are already gone. You just don't know it yet. Eva took a slow step forward, her voice calm but firm. You don't have to do this, Blake. We can still stop this. We can still fix things. We're not too far gone. Blake's lip curled into a bitter smile, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. He wasn't as sure of his decision as he was trying to make Ryan believe. I wish I could believe you, Blake whispered, his voice cracking. But I've already made my choice. The barrel of the gun wavered, pointing first at Ryan, then to Eva, then back to Ryan. Blake was torn, struggling with something deep inside himself that neither Ryan nor Eva could quite reach. There was an almost palpable ache in the air, the weight of a soul fighting its own war. But before Ryan could take another step, before he could try to talk Blake down once more, Cruz's voice sliced through the moment like a blade. Enough! Cruz shouted, his tone laced with fury. Blake, do your job. Shoot them. Blake froze. The command cut through him like a knife, and for a split second, his eyes widened with what could only be described as fear. Fear of Cruz, fear of the reality he had been forced into. Ryan saw the hesitation, the flash of doubt in Blake's eyes, and he knew. He knew this was his last chance. Blake, Ryan called again, his voice desperate. You're not a weapon. You're a man. You can still choose. Blake's eyes flickered to Cruz, then back to Ryan. And in that moment, Ryan saw it. The breaking point. Blake's internal war had reached its climax. He was no longer a soldier in Cruz's game. He was a man torn between loyalty to the past and the nightmare Cruz had turned his life into. Suddenly, the gun dropped. Blake staggered backward, his breath coming in sharp gasps, his hand still clutching the weapon, but the barrel now pointed toward the ground. "Blake?" Ryan whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and relief. Blake let out a guttural sound, almost like a sob. His shoulders trembled as he dropped to his knees, the weight of his choices crashing down on him like a tidal wave. I can't. I can't be part of this anymore," Blake choked out, his voice breaking. "I don't know what I've become, but I can't follow him. I can't be the person he wants me to be." Ryan moved toward him, cautiously, as though not sure if this was some kind of trick, but deep down, he felt the shift in the air. Blake wasn't a threat anymore. He was a broken man, just like the rest of them. "I know," Ryan said softly, kneeling beside him, the weight of all they had lost pressing down on his chest. "We'll get out of here, Blake. We'll make it right. I promise." Eva was still on edge, her gun still trained on Cruz, who stood silently, watching the scene unfold with a scowl. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a cold rage. He knew, just as Ryan did, that the game had changed. "You're pathetic," Cruz spat, his voice seething with contempt. "Both of you. You think you can stop this? You think you can stop me?" Ryan's eyes locked with Cruz's. It wasn't fear in his gaze. No, it was resolve. The truth had already been laid bare, and Cruz had nowhere to hide anymore. "I don't need to stop you," Ryan said, his voice steady, "because you're already finished." Eva's finger tightened on the trigger. One shot. That was all it would take. But before anyone could make a move, the building shook. A low, rumbling growl, like thunder but far too close, reverberated through the concrete walls. Then, a deafening crash. The entire warehouse seemed to shift beneath them, the floor groaning as if the very foundation was crumbling. Blake, still kneeling on the floor, looked up in confusion. What the hell is happening? The warehouse lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging the space into darkness. The rumbling continued, and a deep, guttural roar followed it. Ryan's blood ran cold. This was something bigger than Cruz. Something much, much worse. "Get down," Ryan shouted to Eva, pulling Blake behind him as the ground shook beneath their feet. Cruz seemed almost amused, a twisted grin forming on his face. "You really think you've won, don't you?" His voice was filled with dark satisfaction. "You think you can stop me, but you have no idea what's truly happening. You don't even understand what's coming." Ryan's heart raced. He didn't understand. He didn't want to understand. But one thing was clear. They weren't done yet. The building rumbled again, and then, from the shadows, came the first hint of what was to come. A monstrous shape, gliding through the darkness, its eyes gleaming with malevolent intent. And then it spoke. "You're all too late."